evening, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. I'm your host, Maj Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare. And we welcome back Dr. Yuval Weber, our Russian subject matter expert, to cover again, a very sort of newsy period since we last did our last episode. So the big thing, we're gonna jump right in because obviously the 70-ton elephant in the room with a 120 millimeter smoothbore cannon is tanks. And I think it was a day or two after we did the last episode, because we had done the last episode during the NATO conference at Ramstein, where there was a lot of implied and actual verbal pressure on Germany to free the leopards, hashtag free the leopards, because that's one of the most prolific tanks across European militaries. And Germany so far had been not allowing the countries that purchased it under the arms export legislation in place. They were not allowing those countries to send those to Ukraine. But a couple of days after that Ramstein conference, there was a change, and the leopards were freed. And so all the European countries, which by my last count was about 13 European countries, have variants of the leopard, which we're ready to start transferring those. Also, with the tanks, we had one of these, no, and then yes things from the American administration, which was the M1 Abrams tank, which is the United States' main battle tank, has been for several decades now. And a smaller number of those were committed to be delivered to Ukraine, kind of in a distant future here, later this year. But the point was, tanks are now on the table and getting ready to be sent to Ukraine, which is something they've been asking for a long time. So, Yuval, how did we get here? How did we free the leopards? And what are some of the implications of how that logjam got cleared?
So certainly, always a pleasure to be with you, Ian. In the last episode, when it was happening right during the Ramstein conference, the basically brand new German defense minister had said, "We haven't made a decision, but I've ordered an inventory just in case." And so that seemed to be the decision that effectively Germany could be massaged or pushed into a corner until it was ready to come out and basically work with its NATO partners and allies. And in that regard, I think we've obviously seen this in a lot of different things before, in which there has been resistance to giving Ukraine everything that it wants all at once. Part of that is to ensure that the Ukrainians are ready to receive whatever weapon system or platform, and again that there seems to be, and that also providing for the Russians, not the sort of escalation or speed of escalation that would really cause the Russians to make some grievous decision. But it also helps, I think, reflect on what is the redefinition of German security, a year after what the current German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, termed the sea change, the Zweitenung in German. And if I mispronounce that, I apologize to our German listeners. But in that regard, for roughly 50 years, Germany had a foreign policy called Ostpolitik, the Eastern policy, in which their view towards the then Soviet Union and Russia was that they were going to create a much tighter interdependent relationship between Germany or West Germany first, but then Germany and Russia through economic exchange. And that economic exchange is Russia exports inexpensive energy to fuel the German economy, and Germany then sells both finished goods, but ultimately becomes the spokesperson or the spokescountry for Russia inside Europe. That was 50 plus years, going back to the days of Willy Brandt. And really what the effect of the invasion, or the further invasion, one might say, in February 24th, 2022, was redefining German security, because Germany and Europe had a relationship where, in effect, Germany was first divided, but then bound into Europe in a way to reassure the rest of Europe, given the experiences of World War I and World War II. And where the really when we think about these tanks is that there had been, 70 plus years since the end of World War II, 50 years of a relationship with Russia, and really what the German political class was meant to confront in the space of a couple of days is that essentially to be in Europe was to be with Ukraine in a way that was extremely novel and extremely, I would imagine, uncomfortable for a lot of the German political elites, which had really thought that their contribution to the security and safety of Europe was providing a relatively safe and pacific and non-threatening Russia. And once Russia effectively demonstrated that it was going to be a threat and a danger no matter what, in essence, the 50 years of a grand strategy no longer made sense. And so, as we've seen over the course of the past year, what the Germans have been effectively like, taking off, maybe like layers of an onion here, but basically sheet by sheet, is that Russia is going to be very consistent in terms of its maximalist war aims. And so, everything that seemed really crazy for the Germans to do, the more that Russia basically bombs Ukraine, the less crazy each particular thing that they're asked to do seemingly becomes. And so, again, for all the German political elite, the idea of supplying tanks against Russia, in one sense, makes totally perfect, like totally perfect sense. In another, it's like, this is crazy. A year ago, none of us even would have dreamed of being asked this. And I think that is in a way that we can try to explain how Germany is being led along, is being brought along, but has to be kicking and screaming the whole way because they have to manage basically the internal expectations and the political elites all at the same time while maintaining their commitments to the rest of the European Union, to the rest of NATO, and to the security and stability of the continent writ large. And so the tanks. As a last-ditch effort, they had asked the United States to also give over its Abrams tanks, and again, President Biden and Secretary of Defense Austin said, we're not really interested in that until they said, okay, apparently that's fine too. And so in between the Leopards from across Europe, Abrams from the United States, Challenger from the UK, and the Leclerc from France, it looks like Ukraine is going to get something in the neighborhood of what, 300 to 400 tanks over the course of the next year. The Leopards quickly, and then those other ones sometime thereafter, but over the course of this year, it looks like.
Yeah, and I think to give some context to the listeners, why was there such specific pressure on the Leopard? And as we just sort of talked about here, and you mentioned like it was a German export tank in large numbers. So the number of Leopards that are proliferated across Europe are relatively high. The number of European operators, I think I said 13 countries, relatively high. And so a lot of the pressure was, this is a commonly distributed tank and it's in a lot of different countries. So if you're looking to sort of pool your resources, that's a natural thing you would want to go after, who's got the most of the same thing. And now the Challenger and the Leclerc and then the Abrams as commitments to the longer term, security of Ukraine and helping build up their offensive capability. Pretty clear that that's what those are intended for. On the other side, this goes into what has been a recurring challenge for Ukraine is, sometimes your friends can almost be your own worst enemies, not on purpose, but they can create, your friends can create new problems in trying to help you solve old problems. And so we just mentioned 4 different types of tanks, right? That's 4 logistics change, 4 supply parts, replacement and repair procedures that you're going to have to go through. And each of those, the manufacturers may have different lead lag times in terms of being able to deliver more parts in helping build up a, repair depots and a sustainment pipeline for those things to stay in the field. And, if you're Ukraine, that's a problem you would rather have than not have the tanks at all, is have to figure out how to sustain and repair and keep in the fight 4 different types of tanks. But that's still a heck of a challenge. And that's consistent with the smorgasbord of different different armaments that they've gotten from all the European countries. Is you've got chaotic sort of, ball of yarn different types of weapons and munitions that you have to request different parts and different training. The caliber munition type is probably less of an issue because part of standardization across NATO countries is having like same caliber of munitions. So the munitions themselves may be somewhat simpler than all these different weapon systems and all these different supply chains and all this different training you have to maintain. So, again, it's Ukraine. It's a problem I'm sure Ukraine would like to have because having 4 types of tanks that you have to sustain is better than having 0 types of tanks. So not having any sort of armored offensive capability, but it's something to keep in mind that this will create a challenge for them to keep those 300 to 400 tanks in fighting condition. And to go into the Abrams thing, for a small digression here, the way you describe that, I had this picture of like a poker game where Secretary of Defense Austin is kind of just like keeps throwing the chips up in the ante, and Germany thinks it's finally going to get bluff its way out, and it didn't. So I don't think I'll ever want to play poker against Secretary of Defense Austin in that case. But for a long time, the United States had indicated that there were enough challenges to sending the Abrams that they didn't want to commit them. And part of those challenges was, I think we talked about here briefly, was at least with the Leopards and the Challenger and the Leclerc, you've got sustainment and parts and an already existing logistics architecture on the continent that you can draw on for those types of things. You don't have that for the Abrams. So that's partly why we're not going to probably see the Abrams in whatever spring offensive Ukraine launches, is because you got to build that whole chain across the Atlantic, because Abrams have not been permanently stationed in Europe for a long time. And then there were some other parts, why not the Abrams? People talked about how the Leopard it's a diesel engine in that tank. So, diesel gasoline, a little bit easier to probably attain than what is essentially jet gasoline for the Abrams, because the Abrams has a turbine engine, whereas the Leopard is powered by a diesel internal combustion engine. And I did a little bit of research on this because a lot of people made a big point about, it's got a jet engine, so it's going to be much harder to maintain and sustain. Ukraine did have some Soviet model tanks. I think they're later models that did have a turbine engine. So it's not like they wouldn't know how to work on a tank powered by a turbine engine. But the point is, it's a different engine. There's no existing logistics chain in Europe that you can draw on, so you're going to have to build that up. And as well, the Abrams turbine engines are gas guzzlers, so they're going to consume a lot more fuel for every mile that they're going forward compared to the diesel engine. Whether the strength of these rationale or not, it's kind of a moot point now because they're getting the Abrams anyway. But these were part of the considerations of, you want to give the Ukrainians something they can use, and ideally use in the now, rather than 6 months from now. So, those Abrams are probably going to be one of those 6 months from now thing. But again, it's there were reasons why there was reluctance to give them. And those tanks, I think we're giving them 30 roughly or more, are very unlikely to be part of the spring offensive for Ukraine. That said, the Abrams, it's a highly lethal modern main battle tank. And even though they're not getting like the full version that the U.S. has, because the U.S. as with a lot of munitions, there's an export version, and then there's there's the Rolls-Royce version you keep for yourselves. The model that the U.S. has a special composite armor, the construction of which is classified. It's at a secret level. That's not the export version. So the tanks going forward are not going to have the special armor, but they're going to have all the other upgrades that your Abrams has in terms of, optics for targeting, stabilization of the turret for highly accurate fires. So it'll be a good system. The point is, it's just not going to get there very quickly because there's all those other things you have to put into place first.
So when we think about the tanks, obviously, Ukraine has its own tanks, and basically the Soviet era T systems, as well as the more modern ones that they've been able to capture from the Russians. So in effect, Ukraine has, let's say, the T series of varying vintages, as well as basically all these new ones that are coming in. But to the extent that we can basically speculate on how they're going to be used, you've mentioned a number of times the forthcoming spring offensive. And obviously the spring offensive is meant to, the ground is fairly, hard right now. If they'd had all these tanks a couple of months ago, we probably would have seen many more tank battles this winter. They'll get past basically the ground softening up in spring. Ground will dry out at some point. It's been a very mild winter, relatively speaking. But to the extent that you're looking ahead, how do you foresee the tanks, let's say the variety, the potpourri of tanks being used? How are tanks used, and where do you think they will be used to greatest effect in terms of a counteroffensive to retake territory or strike at Russian positions?
Sure. So I will caveat this up front with I'm an assault support helicopter pilot. I am not a strategist or a tanker or
Think
anything
of your
like that.
excuses, Brown. Just get to the tank talk.
Yeah. All right. Tank talk. That could be a good, totally separate miniseries here. But yeah. So but there's two things tanks are really good for. One, tanks are good for fighting other tanks. When your opponent has them, because tanks are very hard to kill, and so part of why tanks. Well, let me reel this back. Part of why tanks exist is to kill other tanks. Conversely, another reason why tanks exist is that they are mobile protected firepower. And that mobile part is another key part of what they have, which if you look at sort of historical trends of tank use, that's a way that people like to use them if they are able to, if they can sort of find a weak spot in an adversary's line to punch those tanks through. Because once you sort of punch through the front line, if they're mobile and they're very highly protected, generally the things behind your front line are sort of less protected, softer targets, because all of your hard stuff is at the front, trying to maintain the front. So tanks are weapons where you would punch them through a weak part in the adversary's line, let them sort of run rampant in the rear and gain territory, sever supply lines, cause chaos, and find yourself a weak point that you can flow other forces in behind to take more ground and disrupt, unhinge an adversary's fixed positions. And once you lose a fixed position, you try and reconstitute that position into a stronger plank somewhere else. And then that opens up opportunities on those still, hardly, firmly defended parts of your front line. You may decide to abandon those because now you've got tanks in your rear and you want to try and reestablish a good front line. And I'm trying to think of, like, I don't like to always go back to the World War II analogs. I think we exhaust that thing. But an example of how tanks were used are, if you compared, say, Desert Storm, if we're talking about Abrams, Abrams were a big part of that. You had some parts of Desert Storm where you had, and shout out to the Marine Corps here, right? You had deliberate assaults with armor into strong Iraqi defenses in Kuwait, where Iraq had built up lots of fixed fortifications, anti-tank positions, in anticipation of a U.S. push directly in them, right? So the Marines did that. They pushed through that, and the Marines had tanks and armored vehicles. Conversely, you had the I think it was called like the hanging flank of the Iraqi armor deep in the desert west of Kuwait itself, and that's where you had United States Army tanks as this highly mobile fist that swung around those fortified Iraqi positions and got behind them and went to go sever their lines of communication, their retreat lines, basically back into friendly territory in Iraq, because it was open desert. You had mobility, and the Iraqis had no fixed fortifications there. So between that, like, deliberate assault and that open flank where you just drive the tanks as fast as you can to get behind the enemy, then you create, the hammer and the anvil that you can sort of crush your adversary in between. So those are some of the ways you can use tanks, and the more tanks you have, like, that gives you the options to do both. So if I were to, sort of speculate how is Ukraine going to use its tanks, I would imagine they've already gone in the sort of like the attritional fight near Bakhmut, right? And we've talked about this before. They don't want to fight on Russia's terms. Russia's terms are highly attritional warfare, highly casualty intensive, combat that consumes your resources, which would mean consuming all of those nice new tanks and Bradleys and Strykers and European, infantry fighting vehicles. You don't want to lose those, so that you wouldn't want to necessarily set yourself up for that kind of fight. So I would think, and especially looking back at what the Ukrainians did in Kharkiv versus Kherson, is maybe, trying to signal a assault in one place, but then trying to identify a weak spot where they can drive those tanks through and all those infantry fighting vehicles, because we talked about last episode, those are also armored, mobile, protected firepower for your infantry. So you find a weak spot, drive your tanks through, and then you've got all these vehicles to bring the infantry right behind them to consolidate those gains. I would think they're going to look for a soft spot where they can drive that armored fist of leopards and challengers and Leclercs and all those other things through to both gain territory, but also dislocate the fixed Russian line. Because they've again, we saw in Kharkiv, once you unhinge that Russian line, they run, right? They fall back. So that's a good way to try and maximize the territory that you're liberating by forcing a Russian withdrawal by dislocating their front line by punching through a soft spot. Where that soft spot is, I don't know. We've talked about where some of the key terrain is. Looking down at Mariupol or Melitopol, because you've cut the land bridge into Crimea. But I'm not pretending that I have any more information than anybody else who sort of follows the war and open source stuff does. So where that soft spot is, I don't know, but I would expect that's where they would drive their armored units to cause that dislocation.
And so certainly to your point of, going against relatively softer targets, to swoop behind, etc. I was watching one of these Russian talk shows, and the host, this guy Vladimir Solovyov, who's off, he's there for the long haul, wherever it goes. And this was around the time that the tanks were being announced that they were going to happen, and he was like, well, this is a provocation. It is like sort of like the first stage of coping. And then the second stage of coping is, they don't matter that much anyways. And then the third stage was, but we have plenty of people there in order to, help man the lines. And he was speaking to one of the war correspondents, Alexander Kots, and the guy Kots said, well, we don't really have too many armored vehicles or tanks there. So the first line of defense will just be our soldiers armed with Kalashnikovs against these tanks. And there was a brief moment in which the passage of time was infinite, and both recognized that there are just going to be a lot of dead convicts and just regular guys who were going to be trying to shoot a tank with small arms. So in that regard, when we'll see over the next couple of weeks and months when and if these tanks get delivered, when these tanks get delivered, where they might be used, and ultimately as part of what larger combined arms operation Ukraine will endeavor to break Russian lines or retake territory, or whatever combination of the above.
But yeah, that's interesting. Well, I get it. He's he's a what qualifies as a newscaster in Russia, and he's trying to tell the story, but that contrast, to be fair, a well-trained and well-equipped infantry anti-armor team can be deadly effective against tanks. You're assuming some more risk there because the tank has lots of protection and your infantry anti-armor teams generally don't. But again, a well-trained team can be highly effective, and that's something that we've seen all the way back to the Yom Kippur War between the Arab states and Israel. That was one of the big outcomes, right? Was a lot of the tank losses were not tank versus tank. It was tank versus infantry anti-armor teams equipped with advanced and highly lethal anti-armor munitions. So there's a chance. Yeah, I'm saying there's a chance, right? Sure. But it's interesting. I am not confident that Russia has. They might have the munitions, but the training and the quality of soldier to do that, I am much less confident they would have it. And I throw in here I was reading a report from a defector from the Wagner group that was on CNN recently, and he talked about, again, like the quality of the people they're getting, convicts, right, as well as the training they were getting, which is basically nothing. And his story matched a lot of what we talked about before, which is just throwing these guys forward to delay for a minute, or a few hours, right, with zero expectation that they're going to have a larger tactical impact on the battlefield or anything more meaningful than just causing a problem for a few hours before they're dead. And in terms of there's also been reports that it's no secret Ukraine trying to get ready for a counteroffensive, Russia also trying to get ready for an offensive, and so mobilizing 200, 300,000, whatever number you want to take, more individuals. But if they're not getting the quality training and the training to include proper employment of those anti-armor munitions, yeah, your tank against your infantry, that's going to be a very short and unfair fight for whoever that infantry soldier is.
So in that regard, again, been watching a lot of these, these talk shows and sort of like reading the various Telegram channels of, what they call military bloggers over there, war bloggers over there. And, the talk shows are more oriented towards just scaring the bejesus out of like just normal people watching TV. But the military bloggers are meant for people who take more than a passing interest in what's actually happening in the conflict. And the level of journalism is like much higher on Telegram than it is on TV. Again, they're writing for completely different audiences. And the sentiment on these military channels, like on Telegram, is that Russia has a lot of people and Ukraine is getting better stuff all the time. And at the beginning of the conflict, we've been doing this series for unfortunately nearly an entire year at this point. We're about 3.5 weeks short of the anniversary of the first shots being fired in anger. And the thing that I've noticed over the course of this year is the amount of bravado and enthusiasm and just sheer optimism of the Russian side. It really has taken a toll. And in particular, I'm talking about these military bloggers, because they anticipated, in the same way that I think many anticipated, at the beginning of the conflict, Russia had so much more of everything, just all the equipment, all the sort of like greater numbers of people, etc. And that the Russian side has not been able to make sustaining gains in a way that matched with the pre-war expectations. Now, the first couple months from really, although the first assaults on Kyiv didn't work out, if you look at a map of where Russia was before this conflict and where they are now, they have conquered an entire land bridge that encircles the Sea of Azov, which obviously makes President Putin happy because, it puts him, at least in his own mind, in the pantheon of Russian greats. Again, the box marked Sea of Azov as internal waters. Good work if you can get it. But ultimately, given the amount of life lost to get that, it doesn't seem to be a prize worth crowing about for anyone but the president. And basically the vibe, or sort of the tone that one gets over posts over the last couple of weeks, is it's not that the tanks themselves are the end all be all, and it's not that even we can talk about the new type of, it's not exactly the HIMAR, it's the name escapes me at the moment, but it's the new munition that has longer range than HIMARS but shorter than ATACMS. At the moment, the Ukrainians are asking for fighter jets because obviously, like, why not at this point? And for the people who are trying to follow this conflict from the Russian side, the story of this past year has been, it doesn't seem to be working, because even where they gain, that only makes the West give Ukraine more stuff. And the more stuff that Ukraine gets, it then puts greater pressure on the Russian side to make more of its own stuff, to mobilize more of its own people, to empty out, to whatever extent, the prisons of Russia, just to create what they call the ground meat, the cannon fodder. And at that point, there is, I'm starting to not detect some sort of like intelligence analyst here, but it seems the vibe has shifted towards, in essence, something that we talked about really at the very beginning of this conflict. Why did Russia start this particular war? In those days, we were talking about javelins, we were talking about stingers, and that none of those were going to be game-changing weapons. But that it became clear to the Russian side that if Ukraine and the West collaborate to the extent that the amount of munitions and the type of munitions get more frequent and more lethal, and you just iterate up the kill chain at that point, that was going to lead to a period of time in which Russia would not have the escalation dominance. Before the war, we may have thought that would have been years away. We're now nearly a year into this conflict, and like literally fighter jets have entered the chat. And that seems to be what has really filtered down into those Russian like military writers who are now trying to assess, are the tanks going to be like the wonder weapon? Are the Ukrainians going to be able to use them with all the other stuff that they're getting? But the parameters of what is possible on the Ukrainian side seem so much bigger, and the parameters on the Russian side seem so much smaller, that the left and the right, as is where things have started to where things can go, have shifted so much in Ukraine's favor. That seems to be the thing that is corrosive to basically Russian perceptions of how victory might be achieved in the reality-based world that the fighting, men and women of the Russian Federation and like their various proxies and, clients of, private military companies, of what they're able to accomplish. And that seems to be a large part of what, the tanks and all these other things help do, is they help corrode morale on the Russian side as much, if not more, than what is the actual, military capabilities of the platform, in this case, the tanks, that is given over to Ukraine.
Yeah, and I think the the parameters and the wonder weapon things are it's one of these things that I call like a zombie concept. Or a vampire concept. I wish I could drive a stake through the heart, but it just keeps coming back, and there's no way to kill it. We've mentioned whether it was HIMARS or infantry fighting vehicles, now tanks. Like there's no silver bullet thing that's going to win the war now that it appears on the battlefield, but it's a increasing repository of capabilities that Ukraine is able to combine and layer to achieve a greater effect than having any single one of those themselves. But to the parameters, I was I was watching some of the news today, and there were some headlines about Russia making gains, kind of thing. And I looked it up, and it's talking about the continuing fighting that's around Bakhmut, and we talked about Soledar, which my understanding is, I think the Wagner Group, replaced by Russian paratroopers after massive losses by the Wagner Group, they eventually took it at what is probably a ghastly cost of life. And now there's discussions about a fighting going on around the town of Volodar, in which, like, to give some context to this, it seems that the Russian intention near Bakhmut is they couldn't take Bakhmut directly, but now they're trying these sort of pincer movements to try and encircle it to the north and to the south and eventually cut it off. And then if Ukraine has to withdraw, they can say they finally took Bakhmut, which they've been fighting for since last summer. I'm not sure. But they've been fighting for months now. But one of the characterization of the assault that I read today was, Russian forces have advanced hundreds of yards in a major new assault. And I read that and I'm like, you could rip this out of a World War I headline, right? Where they've taken a mile or two of new territory at ghastly cost, and it's so exhausting that the attacking force can't go anymore. And I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but it almost reminds me of something from the Blackadder TV show, British sitcom. Although the Blackadder one they did for World War I is some of the darkest comedy I've ever seen. But they were talking about this breakthrough where British forces had finally taken some territory, and this general asked the staff officer, "Well, how much territory do we actually take?" And the staff officer takes out a measuring tape and is like, And he says, "About 5 feet." And the general's like, "Well, what's the scale of this map?" And the staff officer says, "Well, it's 1-to-1, sir. But it's superbly detailed. Look, here's a little worm," kind of thing. But it's like, you're talking hundreds of yards after months of trying to take this town. You can't sustain that. The bodies coming to the front line, whether it's 200,000 or 300,000, that's one thing. But Russia's talking about bodies, literally, that they're gonna use to try and change the game. Meanwhile, Ukraine is talking about tanks, still asking for jets. And now, as you mentioned in the latest tranche, at least Reuters was reporting that this it was the ground launched small diameter bomb, which is sort of this intermediary between HIMARS and the ATACMS missile. It's not as far as ATACMS, but it's a longer range than HIMARS. So Ukraine again is, as this conflict goes on, yeah, Russia's throwing more bodies, but Ukraine is getting increasingly sophisticated, longer range precision munitions to do more things on the battlefield, combined with all the other capabilities that it gets.
So in that regard, when we now think about, Russia's way of war, we've talked for, nearly a year about the casualty intensive way of war. The specter of an additional mobilization has been raised in recent weeks. And, in terms of the reporting on the first mobilization, it was mooted for a couple of weeks on end when Russia was clearly unable to, you know, to buck up morale, as it were. And in fact, it was those military bloggers, the ones who had noted that basically the fall of the Russian territory of Kharkiv, as it were, and obviously the Ukrainians getting their territory back, that was essentially the first time that opposition to Putin, or at least criticism of Putin, had emerged, so to speak, from the right. That is, from the nationalist perspective, that Putin was ineffective at prosecuting the conflict. And that frightened Putin enough, and the people around him enough, that they called basically out of the blue, in the same way that they had done, started the conflict itself, created basically a requirement for the various military districts around the country to do a mobilization of eligible citizens. They got 300,000 to 500,000 people, primarily from poor and ethnic and rural areas. That caused basically like a national trauma, or small national trauma. Obviously, nothing what the Ukrainians are suffering, but ultimately something in Russia that really brought the special military operation home, the war home, as it were, in a way that things had not, in a way that was contrary to the rest of the war up to that point, in which the government was always talking about successes and keeping basically the fighting away from regular people. And so since the mobilization has happened, what we've seen in terms of the reporting on people in the front is that Russia, for the stories of the individual sacrifice, the heroes, in order to inspire those back home. There hasn't been very much, because the fighting has been something to the effect of, as you were describing, just men into the meat grinder. And the successes of Wagner, the individuals of Wagner, are the people who have done very bad things. So these are not, popular people. And in fact, there's been a number of instances in which individuals who have been, given medals for their heroism, people then obviously do a Yandex search of their names, and then go to the victim's family, as it were, as it happened. There was one person who received a medal for bravery. Turns out he had killed 4 people, and he was going to be released at the end of his service. And the 4 people that he had killed he had killed one of his business associates, in a business dispute, and also killed that guy's entire family at the same time. And so the reporting on that, which is now obviously by people who have since been declared foreign agents, is that the relatives of an entire family who was murdered was saying, we should not be celebrating people who are very consistent killers. And that person who had done the killing was openly saying that he was going to go live in Turkey thereafter. So what Russia wants is this idea that the Russian people have answered the call to sacrifice in the same way that what happened at the beginning for them when the Germans invaded in World War II and catalyzed what they call the Great Patriotic War. They're not getting those stories. And so what we're seeing in terms of, perhaps the second mobilization is that there's obviously extremely limited interest across the country for it. And now that there has been at least the example of what happened the first time, the journalists, what few remaining independent journalists there are in Russia, are not reporting that they're seeing the preparations. and their sources, in various ministries are not reporting that there is preparations for a second mobilization. So this either means that the Russian Ministry of Defense is trying to think very hard about how to use the 300,000 plus that they got the first time, or they're going to do another mobilization, but they're going to do it in an even more shocking way to the population than before, which is again high risk for Putin, because what it means is that he creates another, couple 100,000 people plus their families and their relatives who suddenly don't know what the future looks like. And that can only be done every so often. So when we think about the second mobilization, the two questions are, is the Russian Ministry of Defense able to bring them to the front in any sort of meaningful manner, even if they don't care about the preservation of human life? But can they actually put them in uniforms with guns in their hands, facing Ukrainian tanks? And second, can they manage the domestic fallout from taking another 1.5% of Russia's entire workforce from their homes, from the factories, and into the front lines? Not a lot of clarity on either, but obviously, like when we keep thinking about it, those are the true logistical questions and the true political questions that we'll be looking at as this particular storyline develops.
To this point, there's been no visible sort of, well, I say in the first round of mobilization, there were some visible pushbacks, but it ultimately seemed like Putin got the number of bodies and boosts that he wanted. But there's the you fool me once, shame on you, sort of fool me twice, shame on me thing. I think in a second round, a population cannot ignore the things that are right in front of its face forever. And so I think there's going to be some extra challenges here. And I was looking again at that story about the defector from the Wagner group, and some of the things in that story that are going to have to, the Russian population is probably going to be thinking about, say the Wagner group is trying to recruit in a way that the Ministry of Defense was not, by offering like payout, like lots of money up front and then payout bonuses if you got killed as an insurance policy to your family. Right. But, reporting both from this one individual and from advocacy groups who have been analyzing, these prisoners going to the front, saying that these payouts are coming, right? These people are just declared missing. And if somebody's missing, you don't know if they're alive or dead. So if you don't know if they're dead, you don't have to pay out that insurance policy, essentially. So you do that enough, eventually people are going to figure out that, the rug is being pulled out from under them. That's going to impact your ability to either recruit for the private military companies like Wagner Group, or make it a lot more challenging to make people show up for their mobilization orders. And when I read that specific piece, it reminded me of, I think there was an Institute for the Study of War report I read about right around sort of, the invasion of Crimea. And then shortly after that, in terms of like the low level conflict in Luhansk and Donetsk. But it was, the Putin government taking these measures to make people who were killed just sort of disappear, right? Like bodies not shipped back home or shipped home anonymously. And then there's no body of your loved one that you have to deal with because they just never sent the bodies back, to be properly buried or mourned. You can only do that up to a point before people get tired of not knowing what's going on with their loved ones. So the messaging is certainly that there are more Russians coming, and we're going to solve this with more Russians. It's going to be something to watch in terms of how many Russians they're able to recruit / coerce / entice with all kinds of lies and promises and show up. But then it goes back to that, whoever shows up, the quality of stuff they're getting, and again, with the Wagner group guy was talking about, they're just, he talks about no real tactics, no real training, and they're just thrown in there as, temporary speed bumps with their bodies. I guess the last thing that we would watch is, if there's going to be preparations for a major offensive on part of the Russia, we already, like, Ukraine will know, and the rest of the West will know, because there were those same indications and warnings when they were building up for the initial invasion back in, as you said, about a year ago previously. So I think sort of watching those movements and those consolidations will be another indicator of how many people they were actually able to get, what kind of equipment they're going to be able to get. And if it's really just bodies and Kalashnikovs and not much else, compared to Western infantry fighting vehicles and Western tanks and Western longer range, not ATACMs again, but longer range precision munitions. I think there's still going to be a very ugly fight that's going to be brewing, but it's going to be kind of a unfair fight for one side because you can only throw so many bodies under the tank treads before the tanks just keep on rolling.
We can sort of, put a pin on it to say that this ultimately may be the Ukrainian strategy in terms of effectively understanding the social weaknesses of what Russia is facing right now, that by talking about tanks, talking about, the ground
launched small diameter bomb,
the Gilsizm, which rolls off the tongue a lot less easily than HIMARS or ATACMs, which is a failure. Whichever manufacturer didn't come up with a snappy acronym for that one, shame on them. But ultimately, between watching these military talk or these political talk shows, reading the military bloggers, there's a lot more consternation on the Russian side in terms of the way that they're understanding their own messaging. There's a lot of fear on the Russian side about, social fear that there will be another mobilization. And we can see that in terms of what Ukraine is doing to Russia. It's that it is creating, by talk of tanks, by talk of offensives, that it's putting the onus of doing something on Putin and on the Russian side. We've seen this over the course of the conflict. When you feel that you need to do something, that's essentially the first step towards disaster, because it suggests that you have to rush people who may not be ready. You have to rush people who may not be equipped. You have to rush people who may not want to be there to do things which are very, very dangerous. And that might be, if we sort of then think, Putin hears all this discussion about like tanks and offensives, and he thinks to himself, well, I'm the one who's winning. I'm the one who's just. Let's put another couple 100,000 on the front lines. We'll overwhelm them. We'll show them who's boss, and we'll show them that we can outlast whatever it is that the United States and NATO provides. We can overwhelm the Ukrainians at any point. And if that bet doesn't work, it means that they've chewed up tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in order to not be successful. And then that creates a lot more pressure on the Russian side, because you can only draw from the well of mobilization every so often. And so this might be Ukraine's way of trying to cognitively manipulate Putin into making bad military decisions, which he then forces to be implemented through his yes men of Shoigu and Gerasimov, which we talked about in the last episode.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, that was actually an informational angle that had never really occurred to me. And I think one of the things that's come out of this war is like, we don't, when you think your adversary is 10 feet tall and then they reveal themselves to not be 10 feet tall, you don't want to, just go and assume that they're only 1 foot tall, right? Like they're probably somewhere in the middle. So, one of the things out of this war has been the strength of the Ukrainian information campaign at all layers, but it hadn't occurred to me that there could be a few angles to that messaging about weapons. Like, obviously, I think it's fair to say that the Ukrainian government would love to have all the weapon systems they've been asking for. They would want them anyway, right? Because that's a larger repository of military options you have to put a bad thing on your enemy. On the flip side, though, getting your enemy to do something before they're ready to do it, to step into disaster, is a tried and true military strategy. And so, yeah, I could appreciate that part of their strategy is getting them to do something earlier before they're ready, and getting them to overcommit, and then you punch them back in that overcommittal, and maybe that overcommitment opens up one of those those dislocations that you're able to exploit later on. So yeah, again, I'm not trying to make the Ukrainians into Jedi masters or the Russians into people who fall for things, but it's interesting because what you sort of just described is reminding me of the Soviet concept of reflexive control, basically, where you do things to get at your adversary to do what you want them to do, which is at a disadvantage to them, and then you go and exploit it. It kind of sort of sounds like it might be being done back to the originators of that concept, which, turnabout is fair play. So
there's an audience of one here, and this is a guy who has put all in on his legacy being the destruction of Ukraine as extensively and as quickly as possible. And that's essentially the lunge, which, as like a judo guy, I think ultimately we can find the irony that if literally the thing that just came to mind in terms of like trying to understand, perhaps this informational angle, using the weight of Putin's ambition against him and Russia might be an ironic flip over the shoulder.
Yeah, it certainly would be, and it would not be surprising because, again, we've talked about he's in a closed loop. He's in his own echo chamber that he is deliberately constructed over decades to only be told the certain things that he wants to hear. So all the people under him are trained to only tell him the things he wants to hear. So it would definitely be ironic if that closed system of sycophancy that he has built gets him to launch into an offensive that's not ready and that opens up a vulnerability that all of these new things Ukraine is getting is then able to exploit to catastrophic effect if you're Russian, to good effect if you're Ukrainian. Yeah, we've been going. This time has flown by here, so unless there's anything else you wanted to cover here, I think we've covered a lot of ground and got everybody up to date.
So things for the next episode. We'll see where the jet talk goes, and the jet talk goes is also sounds like jet tacos. And we'll also assess Russia's military and civilian budget. The official 2022 budget figures are now in. The estimations for 2023 are also in, and this is going to be the most expensive year of Putin's life, no matter what happens. Just the teasers for the next episode. This is their largest total deficit for 2022 was 2.3% of GDP. Only the height of the pandemic and the after effects of the 2009 financial crisis were worse. Russia's losing in the range of $170+ million per day due to the price cap that went in roughly or so, which will only increase, which was the petroleum price cap on crude. There's a new price cap on refined products, so things such as diesel, which will take Russian losses even further. This is helping to create a budgetary crunch in Russia, and one of the little tidbits that has come out in the last couple weeks is that the number of regions. So Russia doesn't have states; they call them regions. They have 83 plus Crimea and Sevastopol, which is sort of a city-state. In 2021, there were 19 regions in deficit. Because of the various economic shocks, 39 regions are now in deficit. So the war machine will keep going. The economy will keep going because they have no alternative, but the creaking has already started in the machine. And I think we'll take that in greater detail next time.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to table it and look forward to the next one, because we've talked a lot about the one clock on the Ukrainian side in terms of Western support. It's been a while since we've done a deep dive into that other clock, which is the ability of the Russian economy to sustain the fight. So, yeah, we'll go, and if you're an economics nerd, then the next episode is going to be for you. So, so get excited and get ready. All right. Yuval, as always, great to talk to you. Thank you for helping our audience get up to speed. And yeah, we'll be doing looking at Russian economics 101, I guess, on the next one. As well for our audience, Yuval and I have been talking. We'll have a special episode on the 1 year mark of this war to, we'll sort of figure out, I guess, look at some things we got right, things we got wrong, and in the outlook in another month. I'm not going to call it an anniversary, because to me, an anniversary is a happy occasion. And, 1 year of this war is not a happy occasion at all. But we are going to we'll take some time to take a look back at what's unfolded in the last year and see what the next year might look like. Yuval, thank you for your time. Good night. We'll see you soon on the next one.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. As always, we depend on support and feedback from the Team Krulak community to constantly improve our offerings and reach a wider audience. So if you have feedback on this episode, please take a moment to fill out the survey linked in the show notes to help us do better. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel on YouTube, or leave us a review on the podcast app of your choice. It truly does help us reach a wider audience. Thank you as always for your support, and we'll see you on the next episode.